So, should the U.S. be doing anything to encourage greater freedoms in these countries, especially among those who consider themselves to be our friends or allies? And joining us to discuss this, complex issues indeed, we have the pleasure of having with us the Honorable James Jeffrey, the U.S. Ambassador, former U.S. Ambassador to Iraq and to Turkey and to Albania, and currently the Philip Solons Distinguished Visiting Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. We have with us also Jeremy Shapiro, a former member of the U.S. State Department's Policy Planning Staff and current visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution, and my colleague, David Andrew Weinberg, a senior fellow at FDD. And let me start with, David, let me start with you, because I talked about Qatar a lot this morning. Do you have a strong sense of what it is Qatar is attempting to achieve with its Al Jazeera stations?
Well, I'm going to leave some of the Qatar material to Jeremy over here, and I'll focus mainly in Saudi Arabia.
Discussion, I would encourage you in this and other panels, ask each other questions, contradict each other, disagree.
Sure.
Chairs are too heavy to throw at each other, so we won't do a Geraldo Rivera thing here, but let's have a conversation among ourselves, and then we'll have bring the audience in.
My understanding of Al Jazeera is that it plays into a soft power survival strategy that Qatar has. The Qataris saw the invasion of Kuwait in the Gulf War and worried that they can't protect themselves with their own military might. So part of their strategy for surviving after that is to invite in a U.S. military base, but part of it also is to build up their brand and to use Al Jazeera as a tool of statecraft. So as you noted, the WikiLeaks cable several years ago that noted that American officials believe that Qatar uses Al Jazeera as a tool to get in good with friendly regimes or to exert pressure on unfriendly regimes. Saudi Arabia, a country I do a lot of work on, had a lot of trouble with that and actually withdrew its ambassador from Doha for just over 5 years in reaction to coverage largely from Al Jazeera.
Mm-hmm. Jeremy, you want to add to that?
Sure. I mean, I would agree with everything that David said. I think that it's very clear that Al Jazeera is a tool of statecraft, and I like the way he put it, a tool of soft power statecraft for Qatar. I think that Qatar has, in addition to the defensive purpose, it has a certain vision of the Middle East, a certain vision of Islamist ideology that it wants to propagate through, and it has very few tools, frankly, to propagate that. It basically has money and media, and it uses both to great effect. But I think it's important for us to understand, and I think this was implicit in David's remarks, that this isn't principally about a sort of Arab-Western divide. Al Jazeera isn't even really focused on the West. Al Jazeera, as David implied, is more focused on the intra-Middle Eastern issues, and it's unpopular in nearly every country in the Middle East because it criticizes virtually every regime. It is sort of a free media space in every country in the Middle East except Qatar. Yeah. And so Qatar has taken an interesting strategy with Al Jazeera. It hasn't taken a Pravda strategy. It's taken the view that it can expose the frailties and absurdities of its neighboring regimes through a kind of American style. Really, there's a great Christopher Buckley novel on this that I would recommend to you called Florence of Arabia, an American-style television program which basically attacks the stupidities of everybody else. And it does it very, very well. And it's principally aimed, actually more than anything else, at Saudi Arabia. It has occasionally been aimed at the United States, frequently even been aimed at the United States, but it's also frequently been in support of U.S. policy because the key is it's not focused on an agenda which is anti-U.S. or pro-U.S. It's focused on the concerns of the Qatari government, which are principally regional.
Before I go, let me just press you on two issues. One is, you say it's principally concerned with the Middle East, but there's a reason for Al Jazeera English and now Al Jazeera America, and I'm not sure those, though I want your opinion on that, are principally concerned with the Middle East in the sense that they are targeted, Al Jazeera America certainly, for an American audience. Also Al Jazeera Arabic, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, features Sheikh Qaradari, who is brand of Islamism includes incitement to terrorism and is more than opening up space.
Yeah, it's not about us. I think that's the principal lesson. Even Al Jazeera English and Al Jazeera America, interestingly, are not really about us. It is an important element of Qatar's survival strategy that it needs a strong relationship with the United States, and it needs a certain image in the United States, and it understands the role that the United States plays in the world. So it's certainly interested through those various outlets in influencing U.S. audiences. But the point that I'm making is that it's not, in so doing, it's not really involved in the sort of war of ideas, Al-Qaeda versus the West, that Ambassador Fernandez was describing. It's actually more about the sort of internecine struggles of the Persian Gulf.
Although I would add that in order to capture market share and play on populist tendencies within the Middle East, I think that the leadership at Al Jazeera has at times strongly played up anti-Americanism,
Absolutely.
conspiracy theories, and given a mouthpiece to Al-Qaeda as well.
I completely agree with that. It's just that it's not the principal purpose. It is a means to that end.
Yeah. Let me bring the ambassador in on this. I sense you have some comments on what we've already heard.
Gosh, where to begin? Okay, I'll shoot off in many different directions. One is, I was a bit taken back by your remarks because you told us to be provocative, so I'll be provocative
Please.
back. Al Jazeera, while it has a lot of stuff in it that I find contemptible, and some stuff which I think goes beyond the pale in terms of promoting violence, encouraging violence, free media is free media. And Al Jazeera is part of the media landscape. And Al Jazeera America, Al Jazeera English is going to have to compete with others and in the marketplace of ideas. And we got to be a bit careful in saying we're for the marketplace of ideas as long as the ideas don't go beyond a certain specific point. They do, unfortunately, reflect a lot of the views in the Middle East. That's the first point. Second point, I was in Kuwait 15 years ago and longer, and every night at Diwaniyas that we would go to, the Kuwaitis were all watching Al Jazeera. And that was fascinating because at that time, 1997, 1998, Al Jazeera was like a megaphone for Saddam Hussein and pro-Saddamist views. And if there was anybody in the Middle East who didn't like Saddam and Saddam's views, it was the Kuwaitis. And so we would ask them, why are you guys listening to this? And their response was, because we don't get or hear anything like this anywhere else in our country or in the Middle East, because they do have different views. It isn't under the control of a government. And for those of you who've lived in these kind of countries, and these kind of countries, I'm afraid, are all over the world, Russia and China are good examples. The official news, which what people get, are mainly the Bhutanese sub-minister of education signed 23 protocols yesterday, and there'll be pictures of that for 10 minutes as the lead point. So people are thirsty for news, even if they don't like the content, if they think it is halfway genuine and authentic. And that's how people felt about Al Jazeera. And that gets to my third point. That's a good thing, that people have this thirst, regardless of where they are in the world, what cultural or religious background they have. On the other hand, getting back to Turkey, getting to Qatar and Saudi Arabia, these countries do not share many of our values. And as our values are enshrined in the UN Charter, which they are all officially signed up for, that's a problem at a almost legal and philosophical level in the management of the international community, because they are signed up to essentially a liberal world order, and they don't reflect it at all. And increasingly, they're not embarrassed about not reflecting a liberal world order. Again, Putin was cited, but we have the same problem with the Turks right now with Prime Minister Erdogan. So I'll stop there.
Let me just make a couple comments, and I'm going to come back to you with another question. One is, I take your point, but notice I did not say that there should be any censorship of Al Jazeera. I also said that Al Jazeera is not terrorist media. But if we were sitting here discussing Fox News, MSNBC, and NPR, we would talk very freely about what agenda they have. For some reason, seems to be journalistically beyond the pale to ask about Al Jazeera's agenda, to say some have accused it of having, but nothing more.
I haven't noticed that.
I can
guess,
show you, the quote I gave you from USA Today was one of about a dozen I could have
of
picked.
course, you can find many articles in which they don't.
Show me one that does.
Okay, well, I will.
If you do, believe me, I will send out to everybody on this list.
There is, of course, this conference, which is doing it. There are.
I'm very grateful to us.
I participate in many such discussions in Washington, where we discuss Al Jazeera's agenda, and it's a debated agenda. It's a similar discussion like we would have about, frankly, about Fox News or MSNBC. It doesn't necessarily get us anywhere. But I don't find that Al Jazeera is an untouchable topic in the United States at all.
All right, I beg to differ. Let me go back and talk about Turkey a little bit. And two things about Turkey. One is, as I mentioned, the fact that it has become one of the least free countries in the world at this point, and one of the most hostile to a free press and to journalists. And within that context, I'd love you to discuss a little bit about how you see the Prime Minister Erdogan. Would you agree that he is clearly an Islamist and pro-Muslim Brotherhood, and that informs his views on media and pretty much everything else?
Probably yes and no to all of the above. Let me go back to Al Jazeera. When I was in the Near Eastern Bureau, we had a hit team that would mobilize itself. Where's Alberto? Has he gone? He may have been on it back 10 years ago. That would mobilize itself to go out after those guys no matter what they said. But to focus on Turkey, one, I disagree. You said Turkey is one of the least free countries in the world. It's not a good place to be a journalist. That said, I have many friends who are journalists, close friends, contacts of mine, and they're still contacts of mine, and they write all kinds of very critical things against Erdogan that you couldn't get away with even in the semi-free situation of, Qatar or Russia. And I'll come back to Turkey in a second on the journalistic thing, but I think that apart from the journalists, and journalism is a very important part of freedoms and a democratic system, obviously. I mean, it's one of the essential building blocks. Aside from that, Turkey is a pretty free place. Secondly, the problem of Turkey and journalists predates Erdogan. It has gotten worse under the AKP, particularly in the last few years, but it is an essential problem of a statist philosophy that's not only hardwired into a judiciary, which is pretty independent, including independent of Erdogan, but is hardwired into the minds of many Turks, that you don't criticize the state. You particularly don't criticize the state about existential issues. We Americans who lived through the 1950s can understand that. And the Kurdish issue is defined as an existential issue, regardless of the fact that the current government is, to its credit, in negotiations right now with Öcalan and the PKK, which is a legitimate, not illegitimate, but is truly a terrorist group. So the judiciary continues to apply outmoded but very, very powerful strictures against people who speak out against the wisdom that has come down since the 1920s on this issue. And that's very, very hard to fix in Turkey. And as I said, it goes beyond Prime Minister Erdogan. Finally, on Prime Minister Erdogan, it's a hard question to answer. He certainly is the heir to the Erbakan party, which was an Islamic party. His party assembles most of the Islamic groups in the country, but not all of them. They're in a major spat right now with the Gülenist group, for example. And at one point, when the Muslim Brothers were in charge in Cairo, Erdogan, or maybe even before, Erdogan went to Cairo and he gave a speech extolling a secular view of government. Compared to these guys, or those guys in Egypt, Erdogan is considerably more secular. But certainly he is pushing a very strong cultural agenda that leans towards a conservative Islamic view of society, be it the headscarves, be it the role of women, actually particularly headscarves and the role of women. A lot of this is focused on women in Turkish society, and that's where a lot of the resistance is coming from to him, for good reason.
David, I want to talk a little bit about Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia also has a TV station, not as popular, but important, Al Arabiya. And my impression of Al Arabiya was formed the following. I was interviewed one time by an Al Arabiya correspondent, and afterwards we were talking, and he told me that he used to work for Al Jazeera, Arabic. And I said, oh, why did you switch? He said, because Al Jazeera was way too Islamist for me. And he also said, I have more press freedom at Al Arabiya. I said, really? He said, yeah, the line is further. I said, how far? He said, the interview we just did, that kind of ran right up to the line. Talk about Al Arabiya, talk about press freedom, which I think is non-existent in Saudi Arabia, and talk about the Saudi use of public relations and other tools to enhance and shape their image in the U.S. and the world.
Absolutely. So I'm glad you raised Al Arabiya because I think it is an important part of Saudi statecraft as well as the Middle Eastern media environment. There's a reason that President Obama, in his first formal interview with a news program after his election, or after he became president, was inaugurated in 2009, was actually with Al Arabiya. In part, this was because Al Arabiya was seen as a more moderate cousin to Al Jazeera, or a more moderate alternative. It doesn't use some of the loaded terminology that Al Jazeera tends to use. But then again, it still reports from occupied Jerusalem. It still views that conflict largely through a Palestinian victimhood perspective, downplaying Israeli concerns or casualties. Al Arabiya was founded in 2003 in reaction to a lot of the heavy flack that the Saudis were taking from Al Jazeera. It, in part, was seen as tied to King Fahd. It was founded largely under the leadership of his brother-in-law, and according to what employees from its parent company, NBC, have told American diplomats, it's actually also partly owned by King Fahd, the late King Fahd's son, Abdulaziz, who influences the ideological line of the TV program, the TV network behind the scenes. What a lot of people don't realize about Al Arabiya and Al Jazeera and that rivalry is that the Saudis are actually partly responsible for the creation of Al Jazeera. They, in their zealousness to squash criticism of the Saudi regime, closed down BBC Arabic TV in 1996, which they had invited to broadcast on one of their networks on the Orbit provider. Now, what this did was that it left a vacuum because Saudi-tied media was soporific and didn't touch hot-button issues. And it left a lot of pissed-off journalists with a chip on their shoulder towards Saudi Arabia unemployed in 1996, who then went to work for Al Jazeera, which was founded that very year. Now, one thing that you did note that I didn't touch on was how the Saudis try and influence media and message beyond Al Arabiya. The Saudis have spent a large amount of money, tens of millions of dollars, on lobbyists here in the United States. So for instance, there are two biographies of Saudi Arabia's longtime former ambassador here in Washington. And one of those biographies is very high quality. It's by David Ottaway, a former Washington Post reporter. And the other was by a military school buddy of Prince Bandar's. Prince Bandar hired a lobbying firm as a foreign agent to get the manuscript a publisher, to run a book launch event, I believe, at the Library of Congress, and then to promote sales for the book. So there are other ways in which they try and shape the message as well.
I'm going to ask one more question to the panel, and then I'm going to open to questions from everybody
Can I
here.
just make a brief comment
yes,
on
no,
that?
please. Go ahead.
I think that it's important when you talk about Al Arabiya to see some of the dynamic that I think Ambassador Jeffrey was referring to. Al Arabiya is really a response almost to Al Jazeera.
Absolutely.
It is, and it as David said, the Saudi media before Al Arabiya and kind of still is unbelievably boring, and nobody was watching it. What Al Jazeera forced Saudi Arabia to do, forced them to create Al Arabiya. They would not have done it otherwise, because they needed a more dynamic channel that was closer to the truth. I think that was at least that could appeal to audiences, that wasn't so ridiculous that the audiences would say, "Oh, that's just a mouthpiece for Saudi Arabia." And so it really is. It's a reflection of how much more lively the Arab media environment actually is now. And I think to a large degree it is as a result of Al Jazeera. And I think it's important to keep that in mind when you're watching both of these stations, because I think from an American standpoint, they say things which are very obnoxious. But in fact, they actually have greatly enlivened and freed up the Arab media space, and their competition between each other, and with many other stations now as well, keeps them in line to a degree.
If I could just add one more thought, I think that's a very good point. I think one of the mistakes in terms of how people view these channels is that they view them in terms of solely the marketplace of ideas and the marketplace of profits. But in fact, both Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya, as best people can tell based on the information that's out in the public sphere, both of them are money-losing endeavors. So to some extent, they're, if they were fueled solely on the basis of profitability, they might be handled differently. But because there are states with an interest in these, not necessarily every story that they run, but the existence of these channels is an important platform for their views and their interests, I think that significantly shapes the survivability and the role of these stations.
It absolutely does. But I think even though they're not interested in profitability primarily, they are interested in viewership.
Absolutely.
And that limits them, not to the same way that it would limit them in terms of profitability, but these stations are judged by their patrons on who is watching them and where. They want large audiences all over the Arab world, and that does, let's say, keep them in the vague vicinity of the truth.
We'll go to questions, but while we're, just show me where you are, and we'll get let's come around. Well, let's get somebody, come over here in front row here. Okay. And let me ask this and we'll go to you. When we talk about viewership, two things. One is that it should be noted that Al Jazeera America, so far at least, has not had a successful run here in the U.S. It's not attracting many eyeballs. I think I've seen numbers about how much they've paid for each eyeball they've had so far. But we also should mention Al-Hurra, which is the American government's attempt to get into this marketplace and compete with Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya and others. Is it your sense that that's a competitive enterprise, could be a competitive enterprise, will never be a competitive enterprise? Jeremy, start.
Yeah, I don't know. It's not my sense, although I haven't looked at it in great detail, that Al-Hurra is a very competitive enterprise. It's sort of a strange question to me. I think Ambassador Fernandez implied it. It's what his enterprise is doing is going on the offense, but Al-Hurra is sort of defense, and it's sort of saying, I often think, would I want to watch a U.S. government television station at home? And I don't.
Let me just put, I mean, during the Cold War, there were plenty of people who wanted to listen to Voice of America.
That's true, but I think it's an important distinction to make, and Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya are the reason for this distinction. Because in the Soviet Union, there was no really respected outlets that were giving people the information they wanted, and that's not the case in the Middle East right now. And so it makes it a much more difficult environment for Al-Hurra, and I think it's a difficult task for a U.S. government organization.
Go ahead, Ambassador.
Once upon a time, I wasn't a Middle East expert, but was a European expert, and I was the political advisor to Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty.
Right.
I'll tell you the difference in a nutshell. We were broadcasting to populations who desperately, in their soul, their culture, their whole being, wanted to be part of the West and saw America as the city on a hill. And therefore, and also we used a vehicle, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, which was quite independent of the U.S. government, more so than Radio Hurra is. And I think for those two reasons, we're broadcasting to populations that are deeply ambivalent, and boy, am I sugarcoating this, deeply ambivalent about their relationship to the West and their relationship to the United States. It's simple as that.
Here.
Right. Thank you. Nina Rosenwald, Gatestone Institute. I haven't heard anybody mention the difference between Al Jazeera in English and Al Jazeera in Arabic, which is apparently seismic. People who monitor Al Jazeera in Arabic say you listen for an hour and you go out, even if you're Jewish, you want to kill the first Jew you see. Is that virulent? And we're wondering, of course, if in English they're sort of winching it up to the boiled frog level. And of course, Al Jazeera is government controlled by the Al Thani family. and I think their job is to export Muslim Brotherhood. So I think they started the Tunisian revolution by whipping up this guy who just wanted a permit for his fruit stand into a war. So if you could comment on that, thank you.
Well, I'll comment first, and then I'll just say quick, because I mentioned in my remarks, there's no question that Al Jazeera English is much more nuanced, much more subtle, very different from Al Jazeera America. But the boast that Al Jazeera's management has, which is that we have a shared vision, should tell you something. And it may be that there is a strategic constancy, even though the approach is rather different. But I'll let David. I think you.
Sure. One recent episode that I think illustrates how the Al Jazeera media family handles hot button issues when they're sensitive to the regime actually came up this fall, which is when the British newspaper The Guardian exposed in really excruciating detail some horrifying human rights and labor abuses that they said amounted to modern-day slavery in efforts to build facilities for the 2022 World Cup in Qatar. And you could actually see a gradation of 3 different types of coverage on the issue between Al Jazeera Arabic, Al Jazeera English, and Al Jazeera America during the week and a half or so between when that story broke and when the International Soccer Federation, FIFA, was set to take up Qatar's case. During this period, as best I'm aware, based on my efforts to look at their, not their broadcasts, but on their websites, there was nothing on the issue in Al Jazeera Arabic. Al Jazeera English had a very interesting strategy responding, which is that they didn't cover this issue, not even on their human rights page, but what they did do was put on their homepage a documentary promoting the idea that there's modern-day slavery in Nepal, the country that was sending the foreign laborers to Qatar who were dying by the droves, covered in the Guardian story. And they promoted it with a really tasteless Twitter hashtag that was Nepal slavery. So they were going on the offensive on Al Jazeera English, whereas Al Jazeera America did have a story on the issue, but the way in which they covered it flew in the face of journalistic standards compared to virtually every other media outlet that covered the story during this period. So rather than leading with the allegations, these very damning, well-documented allegations against Qatar, they led with the fact that Qatar was handling the problem well and responding seriously was their headline. And then they drew moral equivalency between cost of living protests in Brazil related to the World Cup for 2014 with people dying by the droves building facilities in Qatar. And there really is obviously no equivalence between those two.
Other comments on that? If you'd like, you don't need to.
Yeah, I'll make a brief comment. I think that obviously these 3 outlets have, I think as you said, they have they're gradations of roughly the same thing, but they are attuned to their audience, which is important for any station, and it sort of makes the point that I was trying to make, which is they are very interested in their viewership. But it's interesting to think about the way that the Qatari government relates to the content on Al Jazeera. It is not technically a government-owned station, but I think effectively it is. But what's interesting about being the Qatari government is that, first of all, you're a tiny country. Your interagency process is like 3 or 4 people. You imagine that.
Yeah.
You don't have you don't have a lot of bureaucracy. You can make quick decisions, and you don't have interests in a lot of the things that go on in the world. So Al Jazeera can be relatively free relative to the Qatari government about a lot of issues. But the one issue which it certainly cannot be free relative to the Qatari government is anything that has to do with Qatar. And so the last thing that you want to listen to Al Jazeera about is Qatar. And nobody in the region is at all interested in what Al Jazeera has to say about Qatar. They go to other stations for that. But on other issues, they are interested in what Al Jazeera has to say.
I'm just going to describe Prince Bandar, who you mentioned, who was the Saudi ambassador for years, dean of the diplomatic corps, and as you say, there's a rivalry between Qatar. I'm just quoting this because it's a good quote. He called Qatar 300 people in a TV station, not a kind of.
Yeah. He exaggerated the number of people, though.
Good morning. My name is Ali Ahmed. I'm banned from both Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya, by the way.
Congratulations.
Yeah, the both stations, in fact, to second Ms. Rosenwald, were engaged or have been engaged in terrorism. Al Arabiya, as a reporter in Bahrain, was a member of Al Qaeda, Muhammad Al Arab. That's not his real name, by the way. Same thing with Al Jazeera, with Taysir Al-Louni and others who were involved. And during the Iraq war, they were changing a lot of stories. For example, when there is a car bomb by Al-Qaeda, they would say it's an American missile. A helicopter fired that missile in the middle of the market. So they are very ideological. They're controlled by the ruling families or the monarchies of Qatar and Saudi Arabia. My question is, what does it take for the American administrations to list Saudi Arabia and Qatar, Kuwait as terrorist governments, like other governments? You know, Al-Qaeda has been alive for 30 years. You know, we have many sources and stories and evidence to suggest, to point out the fact, even until now, Al-Qaeda is raising money in Kuwait using Kuwaiti phone numbers and Qatari phone numbers. Members of the ruling families have paid money, Bandar included, the Saudi Ministry of the Interior, the Hamad bin Jassim of Qatar. They are paying for Al-Qaeda. That's why they have been able to attack daily in Iraq, and they are actually very powerful in Syria, and doing the same thing in Yemen. You notice the Al Jazeera, you know, if you know Al Jazeera, look at the case of the famous Qatari poet, Muhammad Al-Ajmi. He's been sentenced to life in prison because he doesn't want to be the minion of this Qatari emir, but Al Jazeera never speaks about him. So, and similar with Saudi Arabia with its coverage of Bahrain, for example, Al Arabiya, sorry. They are very, they fabricate even. They went to the degree of fabricating stuff to discredit the uprising there. So my question is, what is it that the American government needs to see of killing Americans, you know, not only in the United States, but also abroad? What is it that preventing the U.S. from listing these nations or these governments?
Let me get some answers, Ali. Ambassador?
I'll take a first shot, and I'll start by going back to one of my prior comments, which is don't assume that these countries share our worldviews, even if they've signed up to it formally and legally in the UN Charter. There is a great deal of support by individual citizens in the countries you named to Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda offshoots. There is a troubling tolerance by the governments of those countries, or people in them, to some of those transfers of people, some of the movement of suicide bombers and other jihadists, and the governments themselves, as we've talked about here and earlier, support Islamic movements which we would see as, in some cases, precursors to or on the border of some of these terrorist movements. I don't think we have clear evidence that any of the leaders are specifically supporting Al-Qaeda in such a blatant way, but this is a problem. But folks, the Middle East is a whole bushel of problems, and we turn to those three countries to help us with many of our problems. The other day, in trying to defend our position on Iran, I think it was Secretary Kerry talked about the 35,000 troops that we have standing to arms in the Middle East. Guess where most of them are? Qatar and Kuwait. That's where we have our ground troops, and with a lot of support from Saudi Arabia. And so these are our allies in many of the struggles in the Middle East. They have been our allies. Think of Saudi Arabia in the middle years of the last decade in the direct struggle against Al-Qaeda. We have Saudi support in Yemen for much of what we do, and it goes on and on and on. It's just a complicated, messy part of the world.
Go ahead, David, then we'll go to a question. Go ahead.
Short answer, it's just simply never going to happen. I think, yeah. Well, I actually would defer to Jeremy on part of this. I think you wrote a very interesting piece on U.S. Frustrations with Qatar, and the fact that in spite of this, we've done very little to raise these at an official level. I was wondering if you could sort of walk through some of our concerns about Qatari policies in Libya, Syria, elsewhere.
Yeah, look, I mean, for both Qatar and Saudi Arabia, and even Turkey, really, although to a lesser extent, we have all sorts of policy differences with them. We have all sorts of struggles with them. You've named one, but I could name a few others. And I think it comes down to the fact, as Ambassador Jeffrey said, that these countries have very different values than ours. When they're not, Turkey is again in a slightly different category, but Qatar and Saudi Arabia are not democracies, and they don't look upon the world in the same way that we do. But I personally believe that it's a mistake to sort of insist that they fall into either the ally or adversary category. It's the wrong way to look at them. We also, as Ambassador Jeffrey said, cooperate with them on very important issues for us, on particularly actually on counterterrorism, with Saudi Arabia at least. And this is what we have with these countries is a sort of cooperative and competitive relationship. It reflects the nuance and complexity of the Middle East. And if we want to operate there at all, we're going to have to be able to deal with that nuance and complexity. We're not going to be able to sort of simply stand up and say, you are our enemy and you are our friend, and therefore our friend does everything we want and our enemy is hated across every issue. If we take that view, we will fail in the Middle East. The state sponsor of terrorism designation, which I should hasten to add, we don't have evidence, as Ambassador Jeffrey said, as far as I know, that Saudi Arabia or Qatar are state sponsors of terror. And that's a very specific designation. But it's also a problematic designation because it essentially cuts us off from the country. It means that we can't do the cooperative as well as the competitive things. We can't improve the relationship. We can't really do anything to move them in the direction that we want except overthrow their regime. And as we know, that is a very expensive and complex operation.
Quick follow-up on that, and with a quick answer, I'm just curious to know, do you think that we should or should not be pressing these countries on issues such as freedom of the press, freedom of speech, and human rights? Should we?
Absolutely, we should be pressing them on it, but it shouldn't be a sort of black or white, you must do this or we won't have a relationship with you.
You agree with that?
The answer will always be yes for every country in the world, for every administration. The question is, and Jeremy hit the nail on the head, at what point in the hundreds of démarches we do with these guys in a given year do we put this? What are the carrots and sticks that we tie to it? And we see the problem in all of its glory with Egypt, and I'll just leave it there.
Okay, absolutely. Okay, question over there. No, we have a microphone. We'll get to you in a minute.
Thank you, Evelyn Early, State Department Annuit and Development Consultant. I would like to change the discussion a bit, at least for my question, to the role of the popular cultural media, pan-Arab satellite television, et cetera, et cetera. I didn't get a chance to ask Ambassador Fernandez whom some of his partners he would have included in working in counterterrorism messaging, but I suspect one of them would have been the producers, for instance, of the Ramadan teledrama serials, several of which over the past decade have been very markedly successful in their counterterrorism message, some of them financed by independent Gulfies. You also have the Turkish very successful soft power soap operas like Noor and some of the ones watched throughout the Arab world dubbed into dialects, which present a very kind of quote unquote, I hate the term, but you know what I mean, moderate Islam. You also have NBC 1, 2, 3, is there 4 or 5, where a lot of popular American culture is seen throughout the Middle East. I never knew about Desperate Housewives till I started watching NBC in the Middle East. When I worked for public diplomacy in the State Department, I said the best thing we could do is get a whole bunch of really good serials for NBC that showed the positive parts of American life. Because frankly, we have the edge in the cultural war of ideas, an edge we don't have in the policy war of ideas. So I'd like to hear what the panelists have to say about the role of the so-called popular cultural non-news media, which has dramatic influence across the Middle East and amongst all social classes.
Anybody want to take that on?
It's a very good point. I'm not really the greatest expert on popular culture, as anyone who knows me will tell you. But I would say that it's very clear in the Middle East and, frankly, everywhere in the world that it is American popular culture that people want. And you see that across all of the pan-Arab stations. You see that everywhere in the world. I've never quite, it's not really something that the U.S. government can control. It's actually an element of our society more than our government. And I don't think we would be able to sort of challenge the positive depictions only. And I'm not really sure what the positive depictions are, and especially which category Desperate Housewives falls into. And so I've never really understood what the effect of all of this is. Certainly if soap operas were soft power, Mexico would rule the world. But it does seem to me to be basically a harbinger of our values. And the way that the reason that I think this at a sort of deep level that I can't prove is because so many people throughout the world are afraid of it, and so many people fight against it. And it is, as you say, a place where we have the advantage and where they seem to be losing the capacity to avoid this stuff.
Time for just a couple more questions. Take one right here. Go ahead, and then we're going to the lady in the burgundy shawl.
Yes, Dr. Nisar Chaudhry again from Pakistan American League. I have an observation and a question about Turkey. Their problem had been that they were denied the membership of European Union, and they made a U-turn. But their basic fabric and texture continue to remain secular and forward-looking. That is their dilemma of the present regime, how to deal with this. They wanted to reconnect with the Middle East. They want to reconnect with the roots and with their past. And that is one of the confusion that has been created. The Saudis, their problem is that they had been put a lid on the society. They don't know how to release that pressure before it becomes a pressure cooker virtually. So they have come up not only with Arabia as a reaction to Qatar, Al Jazeera, they also want to release things gradually. They understand, otherwise things can explode. And my question, as Cliff May said, that there's always a reason, objective, goal, or a mission, or a vision, like Fox has. So Al Jazeera does have this is the public consumption when they say we have a common vision, all the three stations. But sometimes the actual vision is masked. You don't know that, or they keep it closed. So in that case, I want to know what is the state and level of freedom of journalism within the state of Qatar, inside Qatar. Thank you.
David, you want to start with that?
Well, just this past month, the director of the Doha Media Freedom Center was dismissed, in part related to disputes over funding and support and pressure from the government. This is after the first director of the center was resigned in protest over government controls. As for the matter of Saudi Arabia keeping a lid on the society and having that be a concern, I think you're absolutely right. I think after 9/11, the regime made a strategic determination to try and both fight against some of Al-Qaeda's supporters within the media, as well as to try and open up the media in relative terms, and there has been a small amount of progress in that regard. There are some topics that are no longer taboo. But that having been said, I think the most illustrative example is a journalist named Jamal Khashoggi, who was fired not once but twice as the editor of I believe it was Al Watan, for questioning religious hardliners. And this was in very indirect ways. The first time he was fired, it was for questioning a medieval scholar that hardliners like to cite for justifying terrorism, and that got him fired. Now, that having been said, the important caveat here is Twitter. the Saudi regime made, probably from their view, an enormous mistake by allowing the platform to take off within the kingdom, and it's gotten away from them, and it's become a platform for the sort of discourse that you can't actually see in the press there.
We're going to have one more question, and then I'll ask the next panel to prepare to come up quickly, because we'll make a quick transition. Thank you.
Amy Schwartz from Moment Magazine. I want to go back one more time to the Al Jazeera question. We heard a very interesting, subtle description of the way the narratives are created, the Al-Qaeda narrative on the one hand, the sort of Muslim Brotherhood narrative at a different point on the spectrum, and Cliff and others did a lot of detailed discussion of specific things that Al Jazeera America does or does not do. I just wonder if you could connect the dots a little bit. Would the panelists characterize the Al Jazeera networks or similar networks as working off a Muslim Brotherhood type narrative or view of the world, or even an Al-Qaeda narrative, or are they just kind of going along with the Qatari interests?
As someone who occasionally is invited to comment for Al Jazeera, both Arabic and Al Jazeera America, I certainly know my views, but the station reflects a largely political Islamic view, but that has many subcategories, as we heard from Alberto and as we've talked a little bit today, some of which goes pretty close to Al-Qaeda, some of which goes into mainstream political Islam, the Muslim Brothers and other groups. But again, that's the Middle East. A very large part of the population of the Middle East is somewhere in that spectrum, and this channel reaches out to and meets their needs to some degree. Obviously, it's, as we talked about earlier, it's controlled by the government. News about Qatar, as we've heard, is squelched if it isn't positive. And the government has some say in the general messaging. But they also are aware that it's part of their mark, and they're out there in the battle for ideas. And frankly, they're not going to do well in the battle of ideas in the Middle East if they don't push a lot of the agendas they push.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that. I think that the Qatari relationship with Al Jazeera is complicated. I mean, it's as I said, it's government controlled, and it doesn't get out of line with the Qatari vision. But the Qatari vision, in the first place, doesn't touch a lot of the issues that Al Jazeera covers. It just doesn't have an opinion on them. And secondly, it's too simple to say that Qatar has a Muslim Brotherhood agenda. It has in a lot of its foreign policy, especially recently, but I think that is actually more a reaction to the fact that Saudi Arabia is against them than an actual reflection of Qatari ideology. Which we call Qatar is a Salafist state, just like Saudi Arabia. They call themselves the other Salafist state. And they would never allow the Muslim Brotherhood to operate within Qatar. To the extent that they push this agenda, it has something to do with their Islamism, but it also has a lot to do, as everything in Qatar does, with their regional struggles.
Yeah, if I could just add on to that. I think the one area in which you would perhaps get the most traction with that sort of argument is Al Jazeera's coverage of Arab Spring events in countries such as Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, and Syria. In those places, I think the network has been exceptionally favorable and probably quite skewed. Yeah, absolutely, quite skewed in its coverage of Muslim Brotherhood issues and Muslim Brotherhood perspective. And in the last couple of months, the station has actually been funding a number of exiles from the Muslim Brotherhood regime in Egypt to, if not make their way to Doha, at least once they're in Doha, put them up in hotel rooms and put them on TV.
But it's also interesting to see, I think that's right, but it's also interesting to see the amount of trouble that Al Jazeera has gotten into in terms of its viewership and in terms of its relationship to the region from taking this very strong very partisan line in those particular struggles. And I detect them pulling back from that a little bit now, because they are alienating their viewership to an extent, and when they do that, they fail in their essential mission.